Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk titled Cultures of Caving, Broadening the Study of Humans in Caves. My name is Maria Perez, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geology and Geography at West Virginia University. I have given this talk before in the NSS convention, and I'm taking advantage of the opportunity to record this introductory talk to reach the broadest audience possible. I hope it encourages many of you to consider themes that are important, the kinds of things that we do as cavers, and also perhaps to be attracted to anthropology and certainly geography and the kinds of perspectives these disciplines have to offer. So this story begins with my father, who back in 1968 spent 30 days in Guacharo Cave, a cave in northeastern Venezuela, where we are from. Actually, he had been caving earlier, a few years earlier, and here he is as a member of the Sociedad Venezolana de Espeleología, spending 30 days in the cavern with his friend Oscar Garbizu. They were trying to do one of these physiological studies of isolation, and they were also finishing the map of Guacharo Cave. I love this image. There's so much story here. There's so many stories to tell. I actually asked Dad to tell me what he played in that recorder, and he said he listened to the Beatles. During his time in this 30-day stay within the cave, my mother, the woman with the heart over her head, visited him. It was a surprise visit. When she got there, she had to travel a kilometer into the main gallery where my dad and Oscar were camping. And it was a surprise visit. And Mom, let me tell you, Mom is a city girl. She doesn't really like to rough it very much, but such is the power of love that she went in there. And then she had to go through this passage where water was all the way up to her nose, but she made it there. And Dad tells the story that when he saw her, he was so excited. And it really confirmed to him that this was the woman he was going to marry. And I am happy to report they're still happily married, enjoying adventures together. I'm very fortunate to have them as my parents. I wish I could tell you that I was conceived in Guacharo Cave, but that didn't happen. I didn't come along till a few years later. But regardless of that, caves were a very important part of my life as a little girl growing up. Here I am at around 5 or 6 years of age with my cousin Patricia and my mom again in a cave in the outskirts of Caracas, where we are from. And you know, after that, caving kind of faded a little bit in our family life. We eventually moved to the United States in 1991. My father was very attracted to mountains and to hang gliding and other things. But it was in 2002 when that all changed. And that was when the Venezuelan Speleological Society actually organized a major expedition to return to the karst of Mata de Mango, a region here in this map, location of Venezuela, in northeastern Venezuela. And in that expedition, we traveled, we had a lot of hiking to do. We located, with the help of locals, some caves that had not been surveyed. And this expedition just changed my life. This was the first time that I actually joined my father in a caving expedition. And I was really blown away by the amount of effort, the amount of work, but also the joy of being out in the field, camping, exploring, and also observing the work of these cavers and translating their observations into cave maps, right? Here's my dad with one of the locals who had been helping the cavers over the years, who have traveled to this region in Venezuela. And here is a caver, descending a deep pit. I was just really blown away. So after that expedition, I went back to the University of Michigan, where I was already a graduate student, and I proposed changing my PhD project. Here's the bell tower for those of you who have might recognize having been in the campus, the beautiful campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Now, when people usually, when I talk about anthropology in caves, so I was studying anthropology as a PhD student, but when I would say I'm in the anthropology program and I'm interested in caves and cavers, people usually assume archaeology. And that's a fine assumption to make because caves are such an important part of archaeological research, right? But other people are like, well, I said, no, I'm looking at cavers today. But they're like, people would often say, well, don't anthropologists study exotic cultures? I'm like, oh, well, cavers are pretty exotic. But actually, to be serious here, anthropologists study culture everywhere. There is culture everywhere where there are humans in groups and even doing whatever they're doing. There's always a cultural, we're always doing things and living life culturally. And caving is part of that. So I pursued a project that focused an anthropological lens on caving as an activity. Let me share with you a definition of culture that I really like by anthropologist Tim Ingold. And he emphasizes that it might be more realistic to say that people live culturally rather than to say that they live in cultures. And this is really important. In fact, I really think at some point we're going to have to change the title of the session. I don't want people to think that there are these distinct caving cultures. In fact, I don't want you to think that there are these distinct cultures out there, like boxed in. In fact, anthropologists have moved away from thinking of culture in that way for a long time now. Because humans are constantly moving, they're constantly exchanging ideas, they're constantly mixing, they're constantly having sex with each other. I mean, really, the issue of interchange, exchange, and flows and movement is really the defining feature of human culture on Earth. So Tim Ingold talks about how it's more realistic and better to say that people live culturally rather than to say that they live in cultures, all right? And it is the things that we do and dream about and say that constitutes the cultural aspects of the way we live in the world. So listen to this definition. I love it. He says, this approach encourages studies of people whose lives take them on a journey through space and time in environments which seem to them to be full of significance, who use both words and material artifacts to get things done and to communicate with others, and who, in their talk, endlessly spin metaphors so as to weave labyrinthine and ever-expanding networks of symbolic equivalence. Oh gosh, okay, cavers. Surely you see yourself reflected in this definition. The journeys, the space and time, in these special environments, right? That are full of significance, right? And the use of words that sometimes people outside of the caving community can't really quite understand. And material artifacts, or tools, or measuring tools, or climbing equipment, everything to get things done and to communicate with others through trip reports, through maps, through art, right? And then when you spin these endless metaphors of the kinds of things that we do, surely caving is also part of culture, and certainly we all cave culturally. So I propose this approach in my work, having trained as an anthropologist and now more recently as a cultural geographer, that we ought to think of caving within a broader context of human cave use across time and space. So with that, I mean to say that I don't think that caving today is somehow categorically different or distinct from how humans have engaged with the underground in the past. I mean, of course, there are things that are different, but there are certain things that remain the same. And exploring these differences and these similarities is part of the thing that I do as a scholar. And certainly, we ought to think of geography in 3 dimensions. And of course, this is no news to geographers, but to anthropologists and to cavers. But it is amazing how still it is so easy to think of geography in 2 dimensions with the representation of the world in ways that are flat. Certainly that is changing with virtual technologies, but still it's easy to forget the 3-dimensionality of the Earth And cavers bring that aspect of three-dimensionality to the fore. And I think that's really cool. So my first research with cavers was back in Venezuela with the Sociedad Venezolana de Espeleología, or SVE for short from now on. And so I went to Venezuela, looked at archives, interviewed a lot of cavers, joined them in activities, expeditions, meetings, and really got a sense of the kinds of activities they do in and day out. There's also a family story here. I've introduced my father, and here he is again, and certainly my mother is part of the story too, since she enabled my dad's capacity to have a family while he went caving. And here is my dear godfather. He already passed away in 2007, Juan Antonio Tronchoni. He was one of the founders of organized caving in Venezuela in the 50s, and then again a founder of the Sociedad Venezolana de Espeleología in 1967, one of several founders. There is, in my research, not only do I study, interview people and do what they do, I also pay attention to the kinds of things they create, okay? So the SVE put out, and still puts out a very important publication called the Boletín de la Sociedad Venezolana de Espeleología. And I've actually done some research on this, looking at the role of this bulletin in promoting cave science, cave and karst science in Latin America. This bulletin, this journal, the scientific journal, ended up being one of the most, if not the most important speleological journals in the 60s and 70s and 80s, published in Spanish. And it's really extraordinary labor of love, for sure. And of course, I look at maps and the stories that they tell, right? I look at a map and it's not just contours of a void under Earth, it's also a story. So one of the things that I do as an anthropologist is apply an approach that we call mappings. And mappings it's just a different way of reading maps. It really focuses on process, right? Maps tell stories. They are dialogues with each other and with the earth and the spaces we map, right? Some voices and some perspectives are represented, others are not. So there's always a subjective element to maps in deciding the kinds of the content and the symbols that we pay attention to and that we capture in the map. In fact, this is a theme that I developed in my very first publication as an early scholar back in 2013, looking at the social dynamics of making cave maps. It's a really cool paper. Anyway, I hope you read it, and if you have some critiques or additions, there's a need to write a part 2 here because of the acceleration of the use of these different kinds of virtual and these different technologies, right? But anyway, that was one example of the kind of thing I do. Another element of the research that I am engaged in is a research that really focuses on the lives of people, of cavers, or people who participate in caving activities that are not necessarily the protagonists, right? And this is also part of my anthropological training, to really pay attention to the invisible lives and labor of people that aren't usually considered, that are not usually highlighted in the big narratives, right? So an example of that is Ramon Alberto Hernandez. He was a caver in Venezuela, and he was a man who didn't have a he wasn't very formally educated, but he was very knowledgeable. He was truly a Renaissance man and a really hard worker. But he came of age as a caver in a time when there was still a good amount of elitism within caving in Venezuela. So, you know, his name wasn't really featured so centrally in the story. So I interviewed him. He was a gardener in a school in Venezuela, very humble man, but also a really fun guy. And we got to travel together to Huachero Cave in 2008, and he got to relive his experiences and remember the people that he loved when he was caving. And he really offered an extraordinary insight into Venezuelan speleology in the 50s and 60s. And I published on that story as well in an article published back in 2016. Another paper, just to give you an example of other things that I do, focuses on the social dynamics of cave and karst exploration. As we all know, it's not just the cave. It's going into the field, it's camping, it's karst, it's hiking. All of these dynamics sometimes are very inclusive, sometimes they are exclusive or excluding when we get to applying the kinds of skills that are necessary to be able to do the kinds of caving, especially the very deep, kind of like the kinds of caving that require a lot of technical vertical skills. That's another paper. A lot of my general introduction to my approach to cultures of caving or caving culturally, I write out in a chapter in the latest edition of Caving Basics. Welcome you to read that. It's already a little dated, but it's still probably my best effort to try to communicate and really just down to earth language, the kinds of things that I'm doing and why the themes of the work that I do are relevant to all of our work as cavers, right? And I mean, look, yeah, cavers have culture. I mean, if you were some Martian that lands on Earth and sees this, you'd probably be like, what's this? You need a lot of context, right, to understand what's going on here in the squeeze box. Well, and I will tell you, not all places around the world have squeeze boxes in their conventions. But anyway, understanding this, right, is part of the work that I do as an anthropologist. And of course, I also get to enjoy it. And of course, I have little kids at home who also practice for their next opportunity at competing at the squeeze box. Unfortunately, COVID-19 robbed us of that opportunity this year, but we'll be there hopefully next year and the next after that. So here's little Carmen, my youngest daughter, making mama, papa, and certainly my godfather up in heaven, if there is such a thing, proud. So let me tell you a little bit about two ongoing projects. The first one I'll just mention briefly. It's a really neat project looking at what we call caver villages in the United States. Previous sessions on cultures of caving have featured many cavers in the community who are exemplar, or living in these exemplary communities. A shout out to John Wilson, my dear friend, longtime caver, very active in the NSS. And it was he who introduced me to the idea of caver villages. And John, even though John is not an academic, he certainly has an extraordinary sensibility to understand or pay attention to this social dynamic of the kinds of things we do. I thank John for all his support in the work we've done together. The last few years of my life, I've been very focused on Cuba-US caver relations. It's a project funded by the National Speleological Society. And with this project, I've been studying what it is, caver relations between Cuba and the United States, but also really understanding the historical and cultural context in which caving happens in Cuba. And there's two fascinating features that come together in Cuban caving. One is great karst, kind of a really important feature, a part of the story. Here's the images of mogotes in Western Cuba, and also a really interesting social and cultural story. One of the key protagonists here is Antonio Núñez Jiménez. He was a prominent speleologist, one of the founders of the Sociedad Espeleológica de Cuba, and he was also a revolutionary fighter. And he played a prominent role in Cuban revolutionary government after the success of the revolution in 1959. And he was a caver and a speleologist, right? So he was also a geographer. He wrote a book called Geografía de Cuba, among many things that he published. And of course, he's a very prominent figure, right, in Caribbean and Latin American speleology. And he worked closely with Fidel Castro here on the right, and then Raúl Castro. This is Núñez Jiménez, Fidel Castro sitting with his cigar, and Raúl here on the side. And this story is very interesting, right? And it's also very, very impactful. But it's only part of a broader story of hundreds of people that have participated in Cuban speleology. Now, just to give you an idea of the importance of this context, which is often missing. So Fidel Castro made a statement back in 1960. He said, the future of our fatherland has to be necessarily a future of men of science, and few people know the context. He said this in the 20th anniversary of the Cuban Speleological Society. he was talking to cavers, right? And in the same speech, he talked about we need to find new speleologists. We need to study caves from all kinds of points of view, right? We need to identify with every cave, every river, every tree. This is how prominent speleology was in Cuba for a long time, which really makes the Cuban case a very interesting one to study. Just a brief map of Cuba. There's over 65% of Cuba is karst, thousands of caves. And again, an example of my effort to try to uncover the biographies and the stories of cavers that aren't necessarily the most prominent, but are also very important. Here's an image of Esteban Grau, a great friend from Matanzas. He is an extraordinary photographer, and his work in photography has really helped keep cave and karst conservation front and center in Cuba. Here's my dear friend Chispa. I hope he doesn't mind. I included him here. A big shout out to Yunaviel Garcia, an extraordinary caver, an extraordinary biologist, right? And he's actually now working on his undergraduate degree, but he is certainly so knowledgeable that I'm sure he can run circles around a lot of people doing PhDs studying amphibians. And his work is really spectacular. And we've been caving together. Here he is taking notes of a small frog that he found in a cave west of Havana. Here's El Turco, right? Dealing with the day-to-day challenges of getting into the field, right? Getting gas for your car. So trying to understand caving as part of the daily lives of people, you know, dealing with the challenges is part of the work that I do as an anthropologist, right? One of my favorite groups of people in the world. These are the young members of Grupo Caverna, one of the most recent newer groups or grottos in Cuba. And they have told me and shared with me their passion for conservation education and showing kids the importance of caves and karst. Here's an image of a drawing that a child made after she learned about caves and the ecology of caves, right? So there's really great work being done by a lot of these grottos in Cuba that really focus on service to the community. And I just think they're a great example to follow. In 2018, I had the opportunity to travel with a group of American cavers and some WVU students. And here we are on the top of the Pan de Guajaibon, the highest peak west of Cuba, in the western Cuba. And here we are all in a cave that we visited during this trip. A shout out to Ryan Maurer, who took the previous picture, this picture, and also the next one I will share with you of the group, and also Jan Robaina, who is a dear friend, an extraordinary caver, and certainly an up-and-coming leader of Cuban caving. Jan organized pretty much all of the details of that extraordinary 2018 trip. He's an educator, and he has been a really important mentor, promoting the creation of new grottos with new and younger members. Really extraordinary guy and a great friend. Other future projects going on. So George Venny and I have tried for several years to get this project off the ground, to create virtual caves and to use virtual technologies to introduce a broader audience to the scientific and human values of caves. That project went dormant. Maybe now with COVID-19 and the importance of the virtual, perhaps it's an opportunity to revive this project. But again, just to give you an idea of the broadness of the kinds of spaces and geographies that I consider as a scholar in the work that I do. I'm also developing a project looking at cavers' contributions to Caribbean archaeology. There is extraordinary work being done by cavers. I'm sure many of you know Pacan Beeses, Mike Lace, a shout out to both of you. Cavers who've been doing really great work with archaeologists and cavers in the Caribbean that are literally upending the story of how we understand the Caribbean, not just physically or geologically, but also culturally. And coming to this project is an opportunity for me to go back to my roots as an anthropologist, and I'm learning a lot. My dear family, a shout out to my husband, Eric Rader. I would not have been able to do the work that I do without the support of my husband and my dear family. And it's really great to be able to welcome and include my children in caver communities, not just in the United States, but also around the world. And here's my daughter, Andrea, visiting Oregon Cave in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. So I have to say, I love bunkers too. I've even written about bunkers and their relationship to the Cold War landscape that includes the underground. I have to tell you a funny story. When I was doing research for this chapter I wrote for a book, I went to Oregon Cave, and the manager had me try a piece of the survival crackers that were put in Oregon Cave when Oregon Cave was a designated fallout shelter. Crappy one at that, because I mean, not much of a fallout shelter. But I had a piece of this cracker when I was pregnant with Carmen, and I have no doubt that that's the reason that she is such a wild child. With that, I'm going to turn to some parting comments. I encourage all of us to look in the mirror, right? What are the motivations for what we do? Why and how do we do what we do as cavers? Who do we include and why? And this is a question that has increased in importance, radical importance right now in this time with ongoing protests around the country, around Black Lives Matter. The NSS has put out a really important statement around its support of the Black Lives Matter movement. But more broadly, I think it's important to think about how what we do includes or excludes, and how can we do things differently to be more inclusive in our practices, right? Could we and should we be different? And I certainly hope that grottos and cavers at every level are thinking about, really thinking about the privilege many of us enjoy when we go caving, and we don't have to fear for our safety, right? But we need to think about how our practices can be both inclusive but also exclusive, and how we might be able to change them. Not just for the sake of our grottos and the future of the NSS, but also for the future and conservation of caves and karst everywhere. I also encourage the young to speak to their elders, and vice versa. As an anthropologist, I am fascinated by the intergenerational dynamics that go on within caving communities everywhere. I think that is one of the most fascinating and rich aspects of caving. And I hope we think about that when we reflect on our history, but also our future, and to also take a comparative and historical approach to what we do. And finally, to seriously consider the ethics of our practice, not just within our regions and our communities and our countries, but also when we travel abroad, right? And to really check at the gate attitudes that put down or are dismissive of local cultures and local views, but also local cavers who are also very much interested in protecting their speleological sovereignty. So I think these are things that we need to think about. And certainly thinking about caving from a cultural perspective can help us not just ask the questions, but also do so with empathy and the kinds of contexts that are necessary to understand human activity and human cultures everywhere. And with that, I turn to my acknowledgements. Thank you for the National Science Foundation that has funded part of my work. Certainly cavers everywhere, especially from the Sociedad Espeleológica de Cuba and the Sociedad Venezolana de Espeleología, where my heart resides. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation. And I did forget to put in my email on the slides, but you're welcome to contact me. My email address is Maria A. Perez, actually Maria.Perez@mail.wvu.edu. I've got a website, it's in my bio. Happy to have people read my work and give me feedback. I'm in the process of starting a book and also turning some of my papers into Spanish so that cavers in Latin America and the Caribbean can read my work. Very important. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much, everybody. Cave on.